Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone out there today. This is Brian Kozlowski. I'm very pleased to be joined by my esteemed colleague, Greg Burns. And for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to walk you through some thoughts about strategic planning. And as the commercials, at least in the US, as we prepare here for American Thanksgiving next week, it's always interesting. And the commercials start and tell us it is the most wonderful time of the year. But when we think about it from a business perspective, sure, we're getting our holiday plans ready and we're starting to make our holiday lists. But for many of us, it's not only a wonderful time for that reason, but it's also a wonderful time for strategic planning, whether that be dusting off what you have, putting together, revising what you're in the process of doing, or putting one together entirely. So we're going to walk you through the next 20 minutes. So we're going to start with an appreciation of strategic planning. Might sound like an easy thing, Brian. I know why it's important, but we want to give you a little bit of a different twist on why it really is important. Greg and I will share some research on why strategic plans fail. You may be surprised how often they do, and give you some of the tools that we use in our work to help combat some of the key deficiencies of planning. Talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics, decision rights, and then we'll share some case studies. And hopefully, when we're done in 20 minutes, you'll see the light to being more like George Bailey and a little bit less like Ralphie Parker. So why is strategy so important? And I asked this question in some work we were doing with a client once, and the client raised their hand and said, Brian, is this a rhetorical question? I said, no, not quite. Yes, we all know why strategy is important, but it's broader than what we think. Because where strategy fits in an organizational structure. You start with your mission. Why does the firm exist? And then from your mission, you develop a vision. Where do you want to go in the next 3 years? So without that vision, a strategy is nothing more than a bunch of turn instructions. At the stop sign, I go left, the traffic light, I go right. Those are helpful, but it's helpful to know where you're going. Strategy also supports your culture. Who are you as an organization? What's important to you? What do you believe? What are your core values? And then you get to strategy. And strategy and culture work together to drive the firm forward. So when you think of answering the question of why strategy is so important, it's a little bit more complex than you think, because there are other areas you need to think about. All of these four come together, and they work to help you think through how you're going to resource plan for a particular year, the type of people that you need, the type of things you want to focus on, and also helps and impacts your decision-making. So the strategic planning is super important for a lot of the reasons you think, and for these, which maybe you haven't thought about. So when you think of the 3 Ps of strategic planning, what are they? Well, first is it's the plan itself. Obviously, that's the nuts and bolts of kind of what you want to do. But it's more than that. There is no plan without your people, understanding who you have and the people that are going to be executing on it. Now we'll see on the next slide why, I'm not going to give you the number yet, X percentage of strategic plans fail. A lot of times it's the people, and there are different reasons for that. So it's developing the plan, understanding the people that are going to play an important role in executing on it, and lastly, making purposeful decisions. Being very clear of who's going to do what by when. Many of you have heard us say that ad nauseum, probably. But it's also being very clear on decision rights, a topic that we'll talk about in a couple of slides. So the data. What you see in front of you are some drivers for why strategic plans fail. Here's the number. 70% of strategic plans fail for the reasons that you see on the screen in front of you. We're going to walk through a couple of them today and some antidotes to them, and at least how we think about antidotes and some stories behind them. So one of the ones that we see most often is when firms do strategic planning, they ignore their core competencies. They think grandiose, they think very broad, and they don't step inside of themselves and think about where are we and what do we do well and not do well. So how do we combat that when we work with clients in the strategic planning process? Well, we start with a SWOT. Many of you probably did it in business school. It's your strengths, understanding your strengths, appreciating your weaknesses, identifying the opportunities, and understanding your threats. It helps you to focus on who you are. What do we do well? Where do we want to go? It seems basic, but when you start at the SWOT, it opens your eyes to, wow, it's amazing. I hadn't thought about those things we do well and what the opportunities lie ahead of us. It also constrains your thinking to understanding who you are and how best to move the organization forward. So SWOT aligns to ignoring the area of ignoring core competencies. The second one is setting unrealistic goals, and they're a little bit tied, those two. And how do we think about that? Well, we use a framework called GHOST, Goals, Objectives, Strategies, and Tactics. The GHOST is centered around what are typically the 3/4 key stakeholders of an organization. Your clients, your clients, your employees, your owners, and society. What the GHOST allows you to do is to set realistic goals, understanding how do you make each of those stakeholders smile, starting very high level, very macro, and getting down into the tactics, which are very micro. But all along the way, it's creating those important steps in defining where you want to go and how you're going to get there. It also tests yourself. As you're developing the GHOST, you ask yourself consistently, is this realistic? Because the third element that we attack is the lack of accountability. And for that, we use a model called the RACI. Now, some of you might be familiar with RACI, very similar. We've taken the A and switched it to an E. But what it is responsible party, who's executing, who is being consulted, and who's being informed. What this allows you to do for each of those tactics, which are really the to-do items of your strategic plan, it puts a name to it. The person who is responsible for completing that tactic. So these are important tools that we work with clients on, and certainly in the toolkit, to really attacking what we see as being three of the major derailers in a strategic plan. I know, Greg, that you've seen lack of buy-in firsthand in some of the plans that you've developed.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I wish I could say that in my career as a leader that I did better than the 30% success rate that you talked about, but unfortunately, my statistics are pretty close to that. But with appreciative inquiry, I kind of like to focus on the 30%. But in the essence of learning, I'll give one example that seemed to come up quite a bit for me as a leader, as a key derailer as we're working through this. So to Brian's point, I think we did some good things in this particular example of gathering the right people in a room, diversity of thought, diversity of experiences. I think our goals were realistic. I think, again, we had the core competencies in place with the right folks in the room. But as we started to get into the strategies and tactics in this GHOST project process, we started getting questions such as, my team doesn't have time for this, or we don't have the dollars to spend to do this research, or this is really hard and it's taking too long. So the process started to break down. And I realized as I took a step back and did postmortem that I really didn't get the buy-in on the front end. Yeah, I may have gotten the, we'll go through the motions with you buy-in, we'll yes you to death buy-in, that will take the time to do this buy-in. But when push came to shove, the kind of look me in the eye and outside the room when things get tough buy-in, I didn't necessarily get that. And the lack of buy-in, I think, is so important on the front end, as I've seen in my career, because I think the proper resources, the communication, the timing all breaks down if you don't have that buy-in on the front end. So my learning is spend a lot of time on the buy-in on the front end, and then you start to do the things Brian talked about, the SWOT, the goals, and the RACI to follow along with that.
Yeah,
Thanks,
buy-in. Oh, no problem. Buy-in is so important. And when we approach strategic planning with clients, our approach is, for those of you that have experienced it, is very inclusive. Because what I've found in working with firms throughout my career in strategic planning is those that fail are when a management team goes into a room, comes up with a strategy, well, what they think is a great strategy, comes out and tries to descend it upon the organization. Many times it's rejected. Why? Because there were only a few voices included in the process. So the strategies that we have seen be very successful, and we'll talk about some of those later, is those that have had multiple voices in the process, those who are strategic thinkers, those who are seeing things and parts of the organization that, quite frankly, maybe leadership is not seeing. And they're providing great input, because what you want to have happen at the end when the strategic plan is finalized, and I really put that in quotes because your strategic plan is never quite finalized. It's a living document. But you want folks to point to the plan and say, hey, this is my plan. These are things I've seen or I helped to develop, and I feel great ownership and pride over that. So buy-in is really important, as is our next topic, which is something, as I mentioned, very near and dear to my heart, which is decision rights. Being very clear on how we're making the decision, what decision we're making, who's making the decision, and the time at which we're making the decision. So, and it really depends. There is no right answer or right place to be on this chart. So what you see is on the two matrices, on the two axes, you have level of buy-in and time. And the less buy-in, or the less time, the less buy-in. So you might have a strategy where the leader decides. That's fine. But to Greg's point, just realize it's not going to take you very long, but your level of buy-in might be lower. The leader might decide he or she would like input. Great. More voices in the game. But again, leader's still deciding. So level of buy-in, a little bit higher, but still low. Time going to take a little bit longer to get to the input. And you see up the line, subgroup decides. So the leader delegates the responsibility to a subgroup. That subgroup might decide to get input. The group might say, you know how we're going to make this decision? We're going to make it with majority vote. 51-50. Great. So again, more buy-in, more time. We have a lot of clients who strive for consensus, which is fantastic. But for those of you who have been in the process of trying to get to consensus, know it takes a lot of time and you may never get there. So what we often say, when consensus is your target, have a fallback. One of these other options on the line. So you might say, we're going to strive for consensus and we're going to strive to get it in 2 weeks. If we cannot reach consensus in 2 weeks, our fallback is the leader decides. Very clear. We have a very clear approach to how we're going to make a decision. What you don't want to do is not be very clear about this. And what I mean by that, I'll give a story and explain why. If you're not clear about decisions, oftentimes what happens? A decision is not made. So strategic plan, an important part of strategic planning is being very clear on the decisions. We were working with a client several years ago where we were doing a strategic plan. And I'll raise my hand and take my 100% responsibility. I thought the decision rights were clear, but what I didn't do is I didn't check. And lo and behold, what happened was the decision rights were very unclear. 2 different people thought they had decision rights. One was CEO, one was a senior person in the organization. We traveled down multiple paths, which is really not ideal for a strategic plan. When we got to the point of finalizing, we had parallel plans. One went in one direction, one went in the other. And what happened was, behind the scenes, the decision rights we thought we had settled had changed. That plan wound up falling apart. And ultimately, leadership wound up slightly falling apart because decision rights weren't clear, which is a real imperative to an effective plan. So highlight this. We highlight this for a particular reason, because this is super, super important. Is you could have the best plan in the world, but if you're unclear on the direction that you're going, the plan will fall flat. So that's one case study. Let's talk about another. And this was a good case story. This is a client who did it right. So client we worked with a few years ago had experienced really strong growth over a core period of time, and then took a step back and said, okay, they could have gone down 2 paths. They could have said, let's go to put our head down and we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Or we can take a step back and appreciate where we're going, which is what they did. So why is it a blueprint? Because they lived into this blueprint. So we went back earlier and we said why strategy is important. And it's not just important for the fact of creating a plan, but it's tying in all those pieces. And they really embraced that. So instead of just diving into strategy, they said, you know what, hold on a second. Let's start at the top. let's understand why we exist. We've been so busy focused on the business from one year to the next. Let's just make sure we're all on the same page with why we started this firm. And it was a great, really reflection exercise for them of why are we all here? And that started to create a lot of energy for them. Once that was locked down, they went to the culture. They went to the left pillar and understood, okay, what are our core values? What makes us unique as a firm? Not necessarily from an investment perspective, but what makes us unique as a firm as an organizational perspective? Why do people want to come here? We spent a lot of time working with them on their values. What's your value statement? How do you think about core values? What's important to you? And then once that was really solidified, we then went over to strategy. And the great part is the strategy now was leveraging all of the good work they had done understanding their purpose and all the good work they had done really thinking through their culture, thinking through their cultural values, what made them unique. And it really bled into the strategy because it helped them to understand what was important and the direction that they wanted to go. They were also very clear on decision rights, who they resided with and who was going to be involved in the decision-making process. And it was tiered based on the decisions. But what was important, it was crystal clear and organized for everyone. And then from that, they focused on some of the bits in the middle. So why is it a poster child? Because they thought about it strategically. They thought about it from the perspective of who are we as an organization? Strategy is important and we know we need to get there, but it's a piece of our puzzle and it's a piece that's important, but we also have to really embrace the direction that we're going and really highlight what makes us unique as an organization. Now, Greg, I know you've had other experiences with strategy. Is there one that you focus on where it's like, yeah, it's really focused on not getting the people right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you've hit on that numerous times, Brian. But I like to think about it as, in financial services, all we have is people and money, right? We don't really produce anything. We're not a manufacturer. We have people and money. And strategically, culturally, as you mentioned, getting both of those things right is how we're successful moving forward as organizations, because all we have is people and money, and it is all about the people.
Yeah. So when you think of the strategy, and the reason why we reference the RISI is you don't create the strategy in a vacuum. You create the strategy thinking through the organizational structure you have, in some cases the organizational structure you want, and how it all fits together. That is super important as a part of this. Because going back to the earlier reasons why strategies fail, it often is that you create a grandiose plan that you really can't execute against. And the problems with that is you lose your momentum very quickly. It becomes, because as you start to hit milestones, or more importantly, miss milestones, that strategic momentum is lost. So remembering and keeping a keen focus on the people is super, super important. Well, thank you for spending 20 minutes with us on this afternoon, or afternoon for me, for morning or evening for some of you. To hear this recording, please visit our newly refreshed website at focuscgroup.com. All the recordings are found under Our Thoughts. Our next and final Hit It and Quit It for 2022 will be on Friday, December 16th, where we'll share some of the key lessons from our work in 2022 as we look forward to 2023. And you'll be lucky enough to hear from our entire team. Interested in any of our distributions, please contact Laura L. Erkley at focuscgroup.com, white papers, webinar alerts, seminar notices, all that good stuff. With that, I thank you again for participating today and wish everyone a fantastic weekend.